everybody, and welcome to Spaces with Josie. I'm your host, Josie, the redheaded libertarian. My guest today is Scott Horton. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, thank you for having me again.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. I love it when you're able to come on my show. I know you're a busy guy. So, who are you? What do you do for those who are new to the space?
I think I'm a pretty typical anti-government extremist from Austin, Texas. I got a grudge against government, and that applies especially to foreign policy. Um, you could consider me, a Ron Paulian, essentially, and with the major motivation for my opposition to empire being my opposition to the domestic police state and the big government in Washington here at home. And of course, you can't have a limited republic and a world empire at the same time. So the world empire's got to go first so we can get rid of the rest. That's basically my thing.
Absolutely. And you have the Scott Horton Academy?
Yes, that just came out late last year. And it's essentially in-depth courses to get everybody all caught up and everything I've learned from a generation of doing this stuff. I've done 6,000 interviews and probably read 6,000 books or something. And so this is essentially, as Tom Wood says, Scott Horton slowed down so everybody else can catch up. And that's at scotthortonacademy.com. And if you want a taste of it, everybody go to thefactsaboutiran.com, thefactsaboutiran.com. And in fact, it's right there in my Twitter bio. And that's a couple of Iran-focused sections from my course, give you a taste of what the Academy is about, but also get you up to date on the history of American and Iranian relations, really since, right around the time I was born in the late 1970s.
Perfect. All right, great. Well, I'm really looking forward to getting into this with you. I do want to warn everybody that Mark Levin has called for my deportation, so if ICE agents storm my house tonight, just know I went out like a hero, okay? All right,
That's so funny.
All right, great. Okay, well, you had a very neat interview today that I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit first. Who did you interview today, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I hope my guy can get it hacked together and published before anybody else. I'm sure he's done some other interviews today, but I got Joe Kent on the Scott Horton Show today. So that'll be at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show and at scotthorton.org and scotthortonshow.com.
Now, what's your take on the whole situation that happened with him?
Well, I think it's great that he stood on principle and resigned. He really did for the right reasons. One, he didn't want to be a part of it. And two, he thought it was important that he speak authoritatively about what's behind this war and how it happened and to try to stop it.
That's good. I'm really glad that he did. I know he'd been kind of controversial from the start. He was always kind of in the news like, oh, he's doing this bad, he's doing that bad. Joe Kent's asking the wrong questions to the wrong people. He's investigating files that we don't want him looking at. He has access to files that we don't want him looking at. And so I kind of felt like he might be one to resign early on. I'm not sure if it's related or not, but Joe Kent, he's speaking at the Catholics for Catholics thing today, or he spoke at it today. I wonder... So I'm a Catholic, and the Pope had called for everybody in the administration who was involved with this war to go to confession, to pray on it, to really take a look inside. And it was within days that Joe Kent stepped down. So did he mention in the interview if it had anything to do with his faith?
No, and I'm totally ignorant about that aspect of his background and whatever. So it didn't occur to me to ask him that. I had heard that the Pope had said that. And obviously that's crucial if that's your sect. So very well could be. But yeah, no, maybe hopefully you'll have a chance to talk to him in the coming weeks and you can ask him yourself.
I would love that. Was there anything that he said that really jumped out at you?
Well, I think, yes, crucially, he said that the Israeli government and the Israel lobby was crucial in getting this war launched. And when I asked him, he could not speak directly to what Rubio said about this sort of blackmail scheme that like, oh, we're going to start the war and force you into it, so you might as well come with us kind of thing. That I really don't believe. I think that's just kind of public relations. I think Netanyahu convinced Trump to do it. Trump agreed to do it and did it. That's what happened here. Not a threat. I don't think that would work. And I don't think that that is a accurate representation of Netanyahu and Trump's relationship and how they would work on that. But that's sort of a red herring, really. The actual issue in question here, I think he defined perfectly, and he said this on the Tucker Carlson show, and he explained this on my show. There's and quite sincerely, this is what they're accusing him for being and saying that he's anti-Semitic and this kind of thing for having this to say. But what he has to say isn't anti-Semitic at all. It's a very specific accusation, and it is that the Israelis and their friends here succeeded in framing the issue of Iran's nuclear program in a way where if Iran has a nuclear program, they have a nuclear weapons program. And if they have a nuclear weapons program, they're getting a nuke, and we can't let them get a nuke. And that's it. So in other words, they dumbed it down and they beat all the nuance out of it. So there's no such thing as a civilian program, and there's no such thing as a safeguards agreement, and there's no such thing as an effective amount of monitoring, an effective amount of scaling back of Iran's capabilities and ambitions that could possibly be acceptable. There's only one solution to them refusing to give up all enrichment, and that is war. And the thing about that is stupid and wrong, but it's also that Netanyahu and, as he put it, Lindsey Graham and Mark Dubowitz from the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, so you might remember I debated on the Lex Friedman show last year, that they convinced him this is the frame to understand this conflict. And I'm not saying that Trump is a total dummy or that he's like innocent here, that he got kind of buffaloed by them. He is not just a grown man, he's world emperor and responsible for essentially deciding to accept Benjamin Netanyahu's way of framing this issue. And now once you've done that, you got all the wrong premises, you're going to come out with the wrong solution. And when the reality is, W. Bush had accepted the fact that, well, they're enriching uranium, and I'm not going to bomb them to stop them from enriching uranium. Barack Obama said the same thing, only he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to negotiate with them, and I'm going to add an extra layer of inspections and an extra layer of restrictions and try to make this thing more acceptable. And then Trump came in his first term, and instead of saying this deal is imperfect and I want to perfect it, and even he could have said, I don't like this deal, and I don't like you, Ayatollah, but we do have this deal. So I demand that you come back to the table and let's improve it. He didn't even try that. Instead, he tore the dang thing up at Netanyahu's request back in 2018. And that was a crucial step toward setting the table for having the war. How can you have a war if you have not just a safeguards agreement, but all these additional protocols to the safeguards agreement and the entire international, extra layer of inspections regime under the joint deal? And remember, the Obama nuclear deal was with the entire UN Security Council. So it was a huge international thing guaranteed by the British, the French, the Germans, as well as the Russians and the Chinese on their side. And so by tearing up that deal and then the Israelis embarking on their massive assassination campaign and all of that, in fact, what did that do? When they assassinated the head of the Iranian nuclear program in December of 2020, and then in was it March or April? I think it was in March of 21. They blew up the Natanz facility, and at that point, the Iranians started enriching up to 60%. And you'll hear the hawks say, "Oh, 60%, 60%," and then they just kind of leave it at that, or they'll say some kind of nonsensical thing. Like you'll hear them sometimes say, I've heard two hawks say, well, the only countries that have 60% uranium, enriched uranium, have nuclear weapons. Well, what does that mean? Nobody's making nuclear weapons out of 60%. I guess theoretically you could, but it would be gigantic and unusable and a ridiculous gun type nuke. So if they were making weapons grade uranium, they'd have gone ahead and enriched up to 90%. Clearly, they're enriching up to 60% to try to get America back to the table and get back in the deal. And so Trump essentially, by adopting the Israeli frame, then trapped himself into having to follow through, not having, in ironic quotes, having to follow through then and destroy their nuclear program. But then they vowed that They were going to restart it. And the Israelis said, look, it's not good enough. See, we refused to give up every last centrifuge. They refused to capitulate entirely. So now we have to go back and finish the job. And see, sorry, one more rant here and I'll shut up. There was this huge propaganda campaign, you'll remember, 8 weeks ago in the middle of January about this popular uprising. Now, there was a big protest movement. Then there was an armed insurrection by, armed groups of people who are burning mosques and sacking police stations and all this stuff. And then the cops fought back, I don't know, possibly paramilitary forces. And there were battles and thousands of people were killed. Something like 3,000 or 4,000 at least, which is horrible, fine. Although we know that these were foreign-backed mercenary groups that were doing a lot of this fighting, particularly Kurds and monarchist militias backed by the United States and Israel. But then remember what happened. They embellished the number. They said, oh, it was 30,000, 50,000 people, even 80,000 people. And now part of that obviously was to try to provoke an emotional response from you, that you would say any government that's this horrible and cruel must be overthrown. And if the Iranian people can't do it, we have to rescue them and do it for them. You might remember that there was a huge kind of, X.com influence op where they would say, the exiles would say, Trump promised that he would help and save us. And so now he has to live up to that promise. They would all say that. Okay, but here's the side effect of that same propaganda campaign, which is obviously, by the way, completely preposterous, that the Iranian government even could have killed 30,000 people without carpet bombing their own capital city. They did not either do that. It took the Israelis a year and a half, a year or more to kill 30,000 people in Gaza, and they were trying to kill civilians all day long over there. And so it's just completely preposterous. But see, here's the thing. I think Trump probably believed this propaganda. And you see, baked into that propaganda is that Iran had to kill 30,000 people, right? Like the Battle of the Somme, he had to kill, the regime had to kill 30,000 people to get the other hundreds of thousands of people to give up and go home. Right? When that's not what happened, right? It was low thousands and they were armed militants who rose up and were not necessarily representative of the people even of Tehran in the big city, much less out in the countryside and this kind of thing. But you see, if you believe that it took the killing of tens of thousands of people for the regime to survive a popular protest movement in January, then you'll believe the lie that all we got to do is drop a bomb on the Ayatollah's head and the whole regime will fall apart and the people will rise up and overthrow the government, which of course did not come true when they dropped the bomb. But you could see how Trump would have been susceptible to that propaganda. Trust me, you just got to hit them hard once and they'll fall. And then he decided, like a kid jumping off the diving board, just close your eyes tight and go for it. Like George W. Bush marching the 3rd Infantry Division into Iraq. Just cross your fingers, man. Go for it and hope for the best, Mm-hmm. And then, we get disaster, of course.
And, Trump, he needs to be kind of complimented, right? This is kind of how you get to Trump is you compliment him. So you could have all of his establishment, all of whoever wants this war, all of the Zionists could be like, oh wow, Trump, you are brave. You are the only one who can take this on. You couldn't take this on. George W. Bush, he couldn't take it on. Barack Obama, he couldn't take it on. Joe Biden, but not you. You can take it on. And, from the religious aspect, because that's what we are dealing with, they are calling this a holy war. So from a religious aspect, I was listening to a rabbi, and he was talking about how in the end times, because they believe their God is coming, or whatever they believe in is coming. And they said, in order for that to happen, there needs to be a non-Jewish Messiah that ushers this in. And so they have deemed Trump the non-Jewish Messiah because their Torah says that the non-Jewish Messiah will be pierced in the right ear, which he was. So they're calling him Cyrus, which is a biblical figure, and saying Silas is back, Silas has returned, and they've given Trump this a god complex, almost saying, no, it's your
Yep.
it's your duty. You're here. You are the non-Jewish Messiah, and they're using that to usher in this war.
You know, people have been asking me about this, and I was making the comparison to Bill Kristol flattering John McCain and telling him, "Wow, you remind me of Theodore Roosevelt." But I and I had sort of heard an inkling of what you're talking about, but I didn't really focus on that. But that's such an important point that, like, look, man, not only was that close, but that was close because Jesus sent an angel down to twist your head out of the way because he has a special mission for you to do what Miriam Adelson says and whatever. And like, if somebody could really make you believe that, then boy, you'd be on their mission, I guess, you know?
Yep, absolutely. I was excited to talk with you about this because just to put these two pieces together of this history of this war, like, I mean, like, I want to talk to you about the Wes Clark 7 and Greater Israel and all of this,
Sure.
and it's all this religious aspect that comes into it too. So I was really excited. I'm sorry, you can see behind me I'm raising kittens right now, and
Don't be sorry about that.
they were found in a dumpster, and
Oh,
they're
really?
they're foster kittens. They're hanging out with me now for until we get them a new home. But yeah,
Yes. Yeah, as long as they get love when they're young enough, they'll be all right.
they do. She's playing with my rosary right now, but that's okay. God bless you, little kitten. So, what is the West Clark 7, and how does that relate to Greater Israel and the whole war that's happening right now? And I know this will be a hell of a tangent, so go off.
All right. Well, okay. Wesley Clark, people might remember, was a four-star Army general. He was the supreme Allied commander of NATO forces in Europe in the Bill Clinton years, and he ran the war against Serbia to break off Kosovo in 1999. Is where he got famous there. That was a disaster. Read all about it in Provoked. But anyway, he ran for president as a Democrat in '04 as sort of like, I could do a better job at this than W. Bush is doing, sort of an angle. Lost in the primaries to John Kerry, of course, but was kind of in that circus then. So, he's not like any kind of leftist, right? He's a Democrat, one hair left to center type of a guy. So he was not part and parcel of the war party in 2002 and 3. Not that he was entirely divorced from it and waging war against it and trying to truth us out of war or anything like that at the time. He didn't really take his negative stance until later. But just so you understand, his relationship with the military establishment at the time of the W. Bush years. He's retired now, retired from the very, very top position, basically, other than chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And then, so now he's sort of rootless and looking for something to do. So he falls in with the Democrats criticizing W. Bush's war in Iraq. And he goes and he tells the story to Amy Goodman, and he also did it in another speech somewhere else. He told the story of going to the Pentagon and basically very shortly after September 11th, and would have been, I guess, October, November of 2001. And I believe, as he tells it, it's a high-ranking military officer who's serving as a staffer in the office of the Secretary of Defense, tells him, guess what, General, we're going to war with Iraq. And this is very telling, and the way he retells the story, I think, is believable, that he said, Iraq, why? Which just right there, we just got hit on September 11th by the bin Ladenites hiding in the Nangarhar province on the Afghan-Pakistan border. What do you mean, Baghdad? Why? And then the guy said to him, I don't know. Is there some kind of connection to him and Osama bin Laden? No, there's nothing new. They just want to do it. I don't know what's going on. Then he says he comes back a week later, and the same guy says, listen, I got to tell you, we got this memo, and it says they want to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, and then Syria, Lebanon, by which they really mean Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, Gaddafi in Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off in Iran. And I don't know if he really explains very well sort of that how that conversation wrapped up. But point being that this was a memo that was going around the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And I've seen people kind of playing this down saying, oh, it's just another snowflake. Donald Rumsfeld would send memos to everyone all day long about everything. And they would oftentimes not even be followed up at all because he never followed up. And it was just his musings or whatever, these snowflakes, they called them, a post-it note with Donald Rumsfeld said something on it. But there's no indication that this was just another snowflake memo there. It doesn't seem like that is the case at all. And because we know that this represents the thinking of Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, and then his Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy, Douglas Feith, and all the neoconservatives working for him in the Office of Special Plans and the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group, where they were coming up with all the lies to get us into the war. And who are these guys? Who are the neoconservatives? They're the vanguard of the Israel lobby. They were essentially not just the Likud, but Netanyahu's faction of the Likud's fifth column in the United States of America. And the thing is, people say neocon this, neocon that, you're a neocon and I don't like you and this kind of thing. And that's fine because in a way, it's fair. Like if it was a dictionary definition, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, one of them would just be a hawk nowadays. People would just call a neocon. But that's really an abuse of the term. It's really a collection of probably less than 100 people who come from the Trotskyite left. Some of them were, you know, in the second and third generations, they were just sort of Cold War Democrats who were instructed by ex-Trotskyites. I mean, even Bill Kristol is just the son of an ex-Trotskyite. He was already a conservative by the time he was born. You know what I mean? So like, but I guess right around there anyway. But so Bill Kristol himself was never a leftist. He was raised by an ex-leftist is the point. But so it's essentially, it's the friends of the Podhoretz and Kristol crew. It's the acolytes of Max Schottman, who had been the most important Trotskyite in the United States, and the original, or well, maybe second generation crew of the National Review, who Buckley hired a bunch of ex-Trots and even ex-Stalinists to be the vanguard of the conservative movement because they were for the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And so any right-wingers who were against that kind of intervention were kicked to the curb, and Cold Warriors, anti-communist in foreign policy action, were given to dominate. And most of them were ex-Trots. So they hated Stalin, and plus they were Americans. So it was easy to take the American side again in the war against the Soviet Union, the Cold War. And so they became the vanguard there. And then you also had Leo Strauss and Albert Wohlstetter at the University of Chicago, and then all their students. And a lot of these guys then, they moved in reaction to the kind of new left hippie movement and civil rights movement of the 1960s, who were against Vietnam and at least didn't show up to take Israel's side in the 67 war. They started really moving to the right, and they became Reaganites because that was essentially where the militarism was. And so, you know, Ronald Reagan talked like a libertarian a lot of times, and he wasn't the worst warmonger of the 20th century, but he had that tough guy streak, and they all got jobs. Well, this certain sect of them, particularly Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Scooter Libby, and Frank Gaffney, and some of these guys got jobs as like third and fourth tier defense secretary types in the bureaucracy in the Reagan years and in the H.W. Bush years. And so, for example, Elliot Abrams, who's Bill Kristol's brother-in-law, had an influential role during Iran-Contra and supporting the Contras down in Nicaragua, and ended up going to prison for it, at least for a short time, with, you know, mixed up in that stuff. At that time, however, H.W. Bush had a standing rule. This is, by the way, sorry, I'm old. There are grown adults who were born long after this stuff. So let me catch you up real quick, just to make sure everybody remembers. Ronald Reagan's vice president was George Bush Sr., and then he became president after Reagan was gone. And he became inaugurated in 1989, served through 93 there. So when he came in, he really oversaw the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and the end of the Soviet Union, and then the launch of America's new order in the Middle East with Iraq War One and all of that stuff. Well, he had a standing order to his government that said, keep the crazies in the basement. And that was Brent Scowcroft was his national security advisor. And the neocons meant Richard Pearl and his friends. They're the crazies, and they can kill people down in Latin America, but you keep them away from Middle East policy. You know, George Bush Sr. was more of the waspy patrician Episcopalian skull and bones type, and he was only willing to go so far for the Zionist lobby at that time. In fact, he got in real trouble with them, standing up to them, trying to push a two-state solution, or even the very beginnings of one. Um, in in his first term, riding high after Iraq War One, and they saw to turn on him and support the Democrat in the election in '92, Bill Clinton. So whether Ross Perot was part of that, rigging that game or not, I have no firm opinion. But anyway, so these neocons in the first Bush term, especially Paul Wolfowitz was then the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy. He was the guy who wrote up, well, him and Scooter Libby and Zalmay Khalilzad, they wrote up what was called the Defense Planning Guidance, which sounds really boring, but it essentially said, we're not coming home after the Cold War. We're staying in Europe. We're going to be the dominant power in Europe, and even we're going to spread NATO into Eastern Europe as well. And we're also going to stay in the Middle East after Iraq War One, and we will continue to be the dominant power. Even though there's no Soviet Union to keep away anymore, we're staying. The empire's not coming home, it's expanding now that there's no one to stop us this time. And so that was the defense planning guidance. They rewrote it to make it a little more politically correct after it was leaked to the New York Times and said, oh, we'll bring the French along on our missions and whatever kind of thing. But it was basically the same thing. So we will not tolerate any near peer competitors. And basically it was a prescription to keep the Cold War going against Russia and China, even though the Chinese had, come and made friends with Nixon back in the early 1970s. The Cold War with them had already been over 15 years and more. And then now the Soviet Union has ceased to exist entirely. And they're saying, well, whatever, good. That just means that we can expand our influence at their expense even more. And this was a huge part of the doctrine of dominance that Bill Clinton kept through the 1990s. And the same thing for the expansion of NATO in Eastern Europe. And so with the former leading to Iraq War II, and the latter leading to the war in Ukraine. This is the same policy of what we say goes. That's H.W. Bush, direct quote. That's what the New World Order meant. People thought it meant the United Nations building up a world government at America's expense. No, no. The New World Order is you would do what Washington, D.C. says, or we'll kill you. That's it. And that was really the lesson of Iraq War I and all that. Now, Bill Clinton didn't have neocons in his government. And, they were basically rendered, kind of a sideshow at the think tanks for a lot of that time until the creation of the Project for a New American Century. And really, Bill Kristol founded the Weekly Standard, I guess, in the early 1990s, was also a very big deal. And then they created this group called PNAC, and they wrote these open letters to Bill Clinton demanding that he attack Iraq and demanding that he pass the Iraq Liberation Act, which he ended up doing in 1998, that essentially made official government policy to seek regime change in Iraq. And Ron Paul warned at the time. This is the only reason I'm so good on this stuff is I was listening to him all the way back then. I first found him in the spring of 97, 10 years before everybody else's Giuliani moment was when I got the idea that I better listen to this guy. And he said, this is a virtual declaration of war. And all it means is that we are going to war. We're going back to Iraq, and there's no stopping it now. Even if Bill Clinton doesn't do it, then the next president will. And this is just crazy. We should not be passing this resolution at all. The great Dr. Paul couldn't stop him, but tried. And he warned, and I quote this in my book, he warned Bill Clinton explicitly in 97 and in 98 that these policies will lead to terrorist attacks against American civilians as well, which he's completely right about. And then so when W. Bush comes into power, they basically take the neocon movement in half. So half of them run the Weekly Standard and the National Review and the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Washington Post editorial pages. And then they're all the guests on Fox News all day long. And they run the American Enterprise Institute, the Project for a New American Century, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, the Center for Security Policy, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. You know, the Council on Foreign the Council on Foreign Relations was dominated by the old kind of waspy types from oil and banking. Well, these guys said, well, we'll just create 10 Council on Foreign Relations of our own and just shove whatever policies we want down America's throat that way. And that was exactly what they did. But then the other half of the movement got jobs in the White House, in the Pentagon, State Department, Vice President's office, especially. So you had, I'll see if I can do this right. In the Vice President's office, most crucially, you had Scooter Libby, you had John Hanna and Eric Edelman and Robert Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland. Then on the National Security Council, you had Stephen Hadley, Robert Joseph, and Zalmay Khalilzad, and and Elliot Abrams, of course. Then at the State Department, you had John Bolton, who's actually not a neoconservative. He's a lifelong right-wing sort of nationalist hawk, but a very good friend of the neocons, a fellow traveler with them, but not actually one of them. But he was very close to them. And then David Wormser was there with him in the State Department as well. And their job was essentially marginalizing the influence of Colin Powell and his right-hand man, Dick Armitage. Colin Powell was the Secretary of State. And his right-hand man, Dick Armitage. And they were there to prevent those guys from preventing the war. Basically, that was their job. Then at the Pentagon, on the Defense Policy Board, you had Richard Pearl, Gene Kirkpatrick, Ken Edelman, Newt Gingrich, again, like John Bolton, was a fellow traveler, not really one of them, but very close to that set and working with them at that time. And man, I'm sorry, I always forget one or two from the Defense Policy Board. But anyway, then under Donald Rumsfeld was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz. And then under him was Douglas Feith, the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy. And then also was Stephen Cambone, the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, who was also neoconservative. But then under Feith was a guy named Bill Lutey, who was a military officer, but also a neocon, a card-carrying former, leftist, but who happened to be a military officer, which is very rare. So he had dual hats there, but was a legit neocon. And then also with Bill Lutey was a guy named Abram Shulsky. And these two ran what I mentioned previously, the Office of Special Plans. And this is where they laundered all of the weapons of mass destruction, fake intelligence. They got it from the Iraqi exiles and from their Israeli friends, and they stovepiped it up to the vice president's office and to the media. And then also across the hall, as I mentioned, was the policy. I know it sounds like all the words are in the wrong order for the acronym, but it's the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group. And that was, again, Wormser, who was traveling around wearing different hats and working with a guy named Michael Malouf. And this is where they worked on laundering lies about Saddam's friendship with Osama bin Laden. This whole thing was a massive effort and included an effort by Ariel Sharon's office to manufacture fake intelligence in English in order to stovepipe into the intelligence stream. And you can read that in an article called More Missing Intelligence by Robert Dreyfus in The Nation, and another one called The Spies Who Pushed for War by Julian Borger in The Guardian, where they talk about how Ariel Sharon essentially had the same problem that Bush had with the CIA, which was they'll lie, but not good enough, not intensely enough to get this job done. So they created their own little Office of Special Plans in the Prime Minister's office over there in order to come up with lies to scare your mama into supporting this thing, was what it was all about. And it was this huge propaganda effort, maybe the likes of which nobody's ever seen before, to make Americans believe that Saddam Hussein was going to give a nuke to Osama bin Laden to nuke you in your jammies in the middle of the night in your hometown if you don't let us preempt this attack by starting this war. And they lied like crazy to do it. And it was neoconservative. Don't get me wrong, because W. Bush was the president, and he was never a Trotskyoid or a Likudnik, right? He had his own thing. Same thing for Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, and everybody, on that same level who helped to abet this thing. But what's crucial about the neocons was, one, that their thinking was essentially completely tied to the Likud party's point of view over in Israel. But on top of that, they were the ones telling W. Bush, you're so smart, speaking of flattery, you're so smart and right about this. We have to do this. And don't worry, Paul gamed this out and it's going to work. It's going to be great. And then, of course, it ended up blowing up in all their faces because they didn't know what they were talking about. Now, their thinking, as far as the strategy, centered around David Wormser, who was a Richard Pearl lackey, who wrote a policy paper I'm sure you've heard of called The Clean Break, or A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm. And there's a companion piece called Coping with Crumbling States, and then a short monograph called Tyranny's Ally, America's Failure to Remove Saddam Hussein, that has a foreword by Richard Pearl. Anyway, it's the same thing over and over again. And what it is Ahmed Chalabi, the Iraqi exile, who is backed by Iran, by the way, told these Zionists in America that if you will only get rid of Saddam Hussein, then you'll be able to put a Hashemite king like they have in Jordan, a Sunni Hashemite family king. You'll be able to put them in charge in Baghdad, and they will tell the Iraqi Shiites what to do, and they will do whatever they're told because they're essentially enslaved to the blood of the prophet, which the Hashemites claim to have, even though that's completely stupid. The Hashemites are Sunnis, and yes, the Shiites revere the descendants of the prophet in their same religious sect, but no, they're not. They're magic demigods who command them to do whatever they say or whatever. Like, none of this was realistic at all. And there's actually a couple of recent interviews with David Wormser where he says he still believes this somehow, that the Iraqi Shiites or any Shiites would have to do what the king of Jordan says. Well, why didn't the king of Jordan just tell Hezbollah to stop being friends with Iran and get along with Israel right now? Why has he got to have a regime change in Iraq for that to happen? Only because David Wormser is an idiot and he believed the lies that Ahmed Chalabi told him. And eventually in the plan, of course, they had to scrap the idea that they would put the king of Jordan in there. He died and was replaced by his son, but they were talking about putting his cousin in there. But anyway, that plan fell apart. And then guess what? They're going to put Chalabi himself in there. He'll be the new leader of the Iraqi Shia, and the super majority of the country. And he promises that they'll be best friends with Israel, and they'll tell Hezbollah to stop being friends with Iran and be nice to Israel. And they'll make sure that Iraq never backs Hamas in any way ever again. In fact, they'll even build an oil pipeline from Mosul to Haifa. The same Haifa that Iran bombed today. Anyway, they will build an oil pipeline, and all of David Wormser's magical dreams will come true because Ahmed Chalabi promised that it's so. And so when W. Bush, who bears total responsibility as the man in the chair behind that desk, he's the one calling that shot, not even Dick Cheney, not anybody else. He's the one who, not Netanyahu, he's the one who did that. But when that idiot said a few weeks before the war, what's all this about Sunnis and Shiites? I thought they were all Muslims. They told him, don't worry about it, boss. We know what is going on, right? But they did not. They're absolute fools. It'd be no different than if they put you and me in charge of reordering the Middle East. You're going to do it wrong because you don't know what you're doing. You couldn't. And now, of course, it was supposed to be easy. But then plan B for Israel is always chaos. It's fine. So fine, we'll break Iraq into pieces and have them all kill each other. And then we'll, as David Wormser put it in Coping with Crumbling States, we'll expedite the chaotic collapse to Syria so that then we can remake Syria in a way that is preferable to our liking. And by the way, he wrote this stuff in 96, which is when the bin Ladenites had already been attacking American interests, including the World Trade Center bombing of 93. And I believe he published this right before the Khobar Tower, or maybe right after the Khobar Towers attack and the Africa Embassy attack in the summer of 96. So before the Cole and 9/11, but still. And he's saying, listen, fundamentalism, meaning like fundamentalist terrorism, is a danger, but we will just have to find better allies against them than the Baathists. In other words, even though Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad are secular rulers, dictators on a kind of modern European militarist sort of socialist line with clean shaven chins, importantly, both of them, that nope, we'll just have to get rid of them. And if it does empower the bin Ladenites of the world, well, whatever. We will just have to find better allies against those fundamentalists than the likes of Hussein and Assad. And why? Not because they threaten the United States, but because they back Hezbollah and Hamas against Israel.
So why are they like this? Is this power lust? Is this just a need for control to move the pieces? Why are the neocons and the neocon adjacent like this?
Well, look, I think belief is a powerful thing. They're Zionists. That's the bottom line. I'm sure, there's, like in the case of Richard Pearl, plenty of money and conflict of interest involved and lust and greed on the part of that scum, But like Robert Kagan, I mean, he's pretty fat. I don't know, like how gluttonous he really is, him and his brother both, but like, and his disgusting wife. But if you listen to Robert Kagan talk, he can seem sincere. He's usually wrong and horrible on things, but he seems to be like trying to analyze stuff and call the right shot. He just sucks at it. In a way, they're not that much different than the rest of Washington, where it's essentially a cult of power. I remember Jim Loeb, I guess Justin Raimondo called it the cult of power. If anybody wants to read that article, you'll like it. You'll like him. But I think it was Jim Loeb who called it the neoconservative mindset, where it's not even necessarily like an ideology. It's just a way of looking at things that just says the solution to our problems is just to blow up whoever's in our way. Why wouldn't we? Why should we have to suffer the existence of this thing we don't like when we don't have to? And it's just, to them, easy. And because it's a government program, they bail upwards, right? It's the self-licking ice cream cone. Whatever they destroy and make worse is great, because over time, that just means more things to do. And so that's okay. And sometimes you'll find them even saying that, outright, that like kind of the purpose of what we do is wreck things so that we have more things to do.
How would you define a Zionist?
Well, okay, there's a sort of very dumbed down and more general sense that it's someone who just thinks there ought to be a Israel, maybe very broadly defined or maybe tightly defined by whoever is using it in that circumstance. I think most of the time when you hear people use it accusingly, what they're talking about is hardcore right-wing expansionist nationalism, Zionism as a project of essentially retaking all of the biblical borders, including up into Lebanon and Syria, east to the Euphrates River, and including down the Red Sea coast of Egypt, and all of these things. You'll see sometimes the symbol of, extra greater Israel, and that kind of a project. So it depends on how you mean it. Usually what happens in these conversations is someone uses the term advisedly to mean exactly what they mean by it, and then someone else pretends that they meant something else by it. So I think, for example, like, I'm not going to sit here and argue for the state of Israel, but I could tell you in a descriptive sense that, I don't know, 90% or more of the controversy comes not really from the creation of the state of Israel in 1948, but from the occupation since 1967. And so what I mean by that is that the original Nakba, or catastrophe, the cleansing of the Palestinians from that territory in the aftermath of World War II in 1947 and 48, that led to the creation of the state of Israel, they created an 80-20 super duper majority of Jews over Palestinian Muslims and Arabs inside Israel's borders, the new borders of 48. So that was a catastrophe in name and in fact for the Palestinians. There were still plenty of problems, remaining to be resolved as far as the right of return and things like that. But essentially, that much was a fait accompli, and they might have gotten away with it if the right-wing nationalists had not, after the 1967 war, taken possession of the West Bank and Gaza Strip from Jordan and Egypt and decided we want this land. And so what's happened is the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza have lived in a state far worse than apartheid. It's essentially like communist level totalitarianism, control over them by a foreign occupation army. And their goal, avowed goal, is to make life so miserable for the Palestinians that they'll just give up and move somewhere else. I'm sure you've heard it a million times. Why don't they just move somewhere else? Well, that's the policy. It's trying to make them so miserable that they'll just quit because the Israelis want that land. And so, but then what happens is, we saw the absolute brutality of the war in Gaza over the last couple of years. But just look at the status quo in the West Bank, where soldiers murder kids and settlers murder kids, terrorize people out of their homes. It's a constant state of pogrom and Nakba over there, of pushing people out through anti-civilian terrorism, direct terrorist attacks against helpless civilians. And when, they had the first intifada, this was the Labor Party, the nice guys, supposedly Yitzhak Rabin, and then Shimon Peres, who instructed the soldiers to break the little boys' arms. They'd crack their arms over their knee like you would firewood, you know what I mean? Kindling for your campfire. And, they kidnapped children out of their beds at 4 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, humiliating their fathers and humiliating them. Your father can't protect you, as some soldiers hold him still while they kidnap his boy out of his bed, take him off. Literally, they do this, take them off to a military tribunal where everybody's speaking in Hebrew, and then sentence children even to administrative detention, no charges, and no real official, even military judicial review. Just lock them away for as long as they want. Sometimes give them back after however long. They torture people to death. I mean, in Abu Ghraib, they had the Palestinian chair. They didn't get that from the Palestinians. They got it from the Israelis. Here's the chair, and here's what you do is you tie a guy where his back is over the bottom of the chair, and then he's reverse hog-tied with his arms and legs and head tied back below the chair, and then you just leave him like that for 72 hours or whatever until he's dead or goes insane, whatever, this kind of. That's the Palestinian chair. And what is the Palestinians' crime? Is it terrorism? No, it's they live on land the Israelis want to steal. They covet that land, so they lie and they kill so they can steal it. That's it. And then so if you listen to the Palestinians, you'll see report comes in. Israeli strike massacres a bunch of little girls, and their moms standing on the street, whatever. And then you'll see the Palestinians say, this is how it's been the whole time. This is how it's been since the middle of the 20th century. That how dare you heathens sit on this land that God gave to us, even though these people are from Eastern Europe. And if you believe in all of the stuff about the descendants of Abraham and all that, well, who do you think the Palestinians are? They are the ancient Hebrews whose later on, lineage they converted to Christianity and then to Islam, and to get a break on their taxes, right? It's not like Palestine is all people from Arabia. They are not either. They're the people, they are literally the descendants of the same people who lived there for 2,000 years. And then what do? They have to completely lie about everything. It's a land without people, for a people without land. Oh, wow. Isn't that fascinating? That the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea had no residents, at the end of World War II. And what a great coincidence that all of these people from Europe decided they wanted to move there then, which, of course, the project had been ongoing long before then. But, the thing of it is this. People are people. Time goes on. I don't know how in the world you get from here to there or whatever in terms of the politics of the thing. Obviously, you got the hardest of hard feelings there. But they have to be able to figure out how to get along. The solution cannot be that the Palestinians have to absolutely lose and be murdered and cleansed out of there, and that we have to be a part of that. No, There has to be some kind of binational state there where the Palestinians have their own police forces and so forth. They don't get to have their own army and foreign policy, obviously, and whatever, they work it out. I mean, Josie, right now, as I said, 20% of the population of Israel, so-called proper, inside the Green Line, the 67 borders, 20% of them are Palestinian Muslims and Christians, mostly Muslims. They're not at terrorist jihad war against Israel all the time. They got citizenship. They're not under occupation. They got kind of second-class citizenship, and it's ugly, but they're not at war because they're not being occupied, not nearly in the same kind, only in a way where you can like say, oh, well, figuratively, they've been colonized, blah, 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 left-wing college student stuff. But nuh-uh, they have citizenship, and they don't do suicide attacks. They don't do rocket attacks inside Israel. What's the difference? The people on the other side of the line somehow got infected with some terrorist germ or something? No, they live under foreign military occupation, commie totalitarianism. That's their problem. They fight the same way that you would fight if anybody ever tried to occupy your town in the same way.
The Ashkenazi Jews, they're from Poland. They're not Semites, so using anti-Semitic against Jews, it doesn't really work because they're not Semites. But like you said, you know, the Palestinians, they are. As a Catholic, what I'm seeing is alarming, especially in the notion of Greater Israel. So they have murdered several of our priests, especially now expanding into southern Lebanon. We've had settlements there. What was that?
Yeah, just the other day they killed a priest in
Yeah.
southern Lebanon. Yeah.
Yep, they killed 2 more. So what they do, they roll in to these towns and they demand everybody evacuate or we're going to kill you, which is what happened after the Nakba too. So the priests, they rang out their bells on their churches, refusing to leave because they've been there for 2,000 years because, you know, we were grafted into the line of Abraham too. The Christians were. So, and what happened, I guess now two more priests were murdered by the Israeli army. So as they expand, what they've done, they've really demonized the Muslims to this point to Americans. They've really, like, you have a bad taste in your mouth about Muslims now. Muslims are evil, they're wicked, Sharia law, bad, everything is bad, this is evil. And then on top of that, you know, these people are terrorists, right? And they've done this, but they're going to have to do it to the Catholics too, because we are on the land too, and they're not going to share the land with the Catholics. So they're going to have to find a way to demonize. But right now, they're just doing what they did in 1948, and they're rolling in and they're demanding everybody leave, and they're murdering our priests. So I don't know how much attention this is going to get, but I know that it's going to get really bad before it gets better, and if it ever gets better.
Yeah. Well, listen, I don't know a lot about this current pope, but I know that he's an American and that he said at least some decent anti-war things here. And as far as, you know, his depth of commitment or his ability to command moral authority over these questions, I don't know. But I do appreciate that he has said some powerful things about this. As his predecessor did. I know his predecessor had his problems, but he went to the Congress and denounced the merchants of death and their servants in these halls to their faces. He said that, you know, for pushing these wars. So, you know, and I don't know, you know, what it looks like politically in terms of the backlash we've already had, you know, with the FBI investigations of Catholics in the Biden years and all that. But there are many millions of American Catholics. I believe they're about a fifth of all American Christians. Or was that a fifth of all Americans?
I think
But I don't know. They're a fifth of something. That's a hell of a lot. Yeah. So, yeah, that's a lot of political power that cannot be, you know, denied or fought in that stark of terms, or at least that's picking one hell of a fight. If they
Yes.
want to say like, oh yeah, no, it's, you know, we hereby denounce all of Catholicism as anti-Semitic and whatever,
Oh,
declare that jihad, you know.
are you following what's going on? So Catholics, we're anti-Zionists just by nature. We're anti-Zionists. We believe that the Old Testament was fulfilled and in the coming of Christ, and all the terms were met in the promised covenants, and now the church is essentially like the new Israel, right? And everybody is welcome, but you just have to repent and believe in Christ. That's our belief. So by nature, we're anti-Zionist. This goes against dispensationalism, which is pro-Zionist, which are the Jews are still the chosen people, and we are against this. So they are conflating, like you saw with Carrie Prejean got kicked off the board because she spoke Christian doctrine, Catholic doctrine. She was kicked off this board. So we're seeing essentially a struggle session with Catholics saying that you need to denounce, your old views essentially and get on board with the Christian Zionism, or you're all anti-Semitic, because anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. They're saying now it means that you
That
don't
ain't gonna
want
work. That
exactly.
ain't gonna work.
What's great? They're using the trans argument. Okay, we're a small group of people, and you don't want us to exist. That's what it is. So that's what the anti-Zionist argument is. But Catholics don't roll over. We're just like, it's our birthright to just be hated. So we just roll with it at this point. You can't force us into a different group of beliefs, no matter
Well,
what.
there's a real crack up there where not only do not all evangelical Christians believe, well, first of all, not only do not all Protestant Christians believe this, but not all evangelical Christians believe this, and not all dispensationalist Christians believe this, and fewer of them all the time. So, we want to paint with a very narrow brush and make sure that people know that if you didn't know, if your dad told you that John Hagee's view was the only one out there, you might find that you would only have to move one hair to maybe even the right in order to find someone who could tell you different. And I think that, here's what happened, right? Was 25 years ago, they promised if you just support war with Iraq, then we promise that Jesus will come back and you'll get raptured up to heaven and it'll be the end of the world and all this great stuff. They sold the Left Behind books at Walmart and all that stuff. And a lot of people really believed that and really were afraid, really supported, get it? War in the Middle East, get it? The year 2000 and like, I don't know, all this kind of like dumbed down David Koresh stuff, basically, right? But then it never happened, right? Either they all got left behind with the rest of us, or the whole thing was just a big stupid hoax, right? And now it's the 2020s. That whole millennium effect is over, and only a dwindling number of foolish people are falling for this anymore, and even a dwindling number of liars are pushing the hoax. So I think that on the Democratic side as well as on the Republican side, on the left and the right, broadly speaking, the Israelis are facing a real crisis of legitimacy, because in fact they have none. As I said, they kind of probably shoulda and coulda left well enough alone. In fact, and I have to go, but I'll leave you with this, that David Ben-Gurion, the founding prime minister, after the war of 1967, he said, we have to give the West Bank and Gaza Strip back up to Egypt and Jordan. We don't want them. Forget the land. What are we going to do with all these people? We're going to take this land. We got nowhere to put all the people. We're going to kidnap millions of people. Then what's that going to do to us? We're going to have to become their military occupation overlords. And then how are we ever going to get them out of the way anyway? Let's not do this. And they said, shut up, old man. You don't know what you're talking about, blah, 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 and kicked him right out of there. He was the longest serving prime minister until Netanyahu was, and was the founding prime minister of the country. And as soon as he told them, hey, man, we should restrain ourselves and not go too far here, they decided that what he had to say didn't matter anymore.
What a great group of people.
Afraid not.
Thank you so much for being here. I know you got to get to another obligation. Where can people find you, support your work?
I'm at scotthortonacademy.com, and most importantly for right now, thefactsaboutiran.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Scott, I'm just going to have you hold on for 1 second just to make sure everything uploads. Thank you, everybody. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Stay free, and God bless.